The Texas State Penitentiary rose like a fortress against the pale morning sky, its concrete walls stretching endlessly, wrapped with layers of razor wire that glittered under first rays of sun, while guard towers loomed with rifles pointed outward like silent warnings to anyone who dared to imagine freedom. Inside, the air was thick with a mix of bleach, sweat, and rust, the echo of iron doors slamming shut, carrying through every corridor like a drumbeat of inevitability. And the voices of inmates rose and fell, some shouting for attention, some whispering their secrets through the bars, and some, like ghosts, saying nothing at all. Officer Sarah Davis walked those corridors with steady steps, the soles of her boots striking the floor with a rhythm that was both familiar and haunting, her eyes scanning every detail, bars, locks, faces, because here routine was survival, yet behind her professional calm lived a woman who had learned to recognize when something about a prisoner went beyond routine, when a look in her eyes carried more weight than their file suggested. In Block C, in a cell no larger than a storage closet, sat Michael Harper, a man whose name had once been spat with hatred in newspapers and living rooms across Texas. 15 years earlier, he had entered a convenience store with nothing but greed and recklessness on his mind, and in a single moment of violence, had fired a shot that ended the life of a husband and father, leaving behind a widow and children, and branding himself forever as a murderer. For years, Michael had been nothing more than that headline, that statistic, but Sarah had watched him change. His once fiery temper had quieted into reflection, his restless pacing replaced with hours of study in the small prison library, his defiance turned into a kind of humility that could not be faked. Inmates who entered prison angry and eager to prove themselves often found Harper sitting across from them in the yard, speaking not as a preacher but as a man broken by truth, telling them about the weight of guilt, about nights when sleep refused to come, about the hollow feeling of knowing you had stolen a life you could never give back. He never excused himself, never pleaded innocence, and that was perhaps what made his presence so different. Sarah had spoken to him on countless shifts, never in long conversations, but always sensing the honesty that lived behind his words, and though she reminded herself again and again that remorse does not undo death, something in her refused to see him only as the monster he once was. As the calendar pushed forward, the date of his execution loomed like a storm cloud no one could avoid, and within the prison walls, everyone seemed to feel it. Guards who usually joked during patrols grew quieter. Other inmates who usually mocked the condemned went silent as Michael passed, and the atmosphere thickened with an unspoken truth. Time was running out. On one fading afternoon, with golden light cutting to the high barred windows and dust dancing in the air, Michael spoke words that would shatter Sarah's sense of order. "Officer Davis, I have one last wish before I go. I want to reach out to the family of the man I killed. Not ask forgiveness. I know I don't deserve that. But just so they know I am sorry. I don't want them to think I never cared. Please let me tell them." His voice cracked. His hands trembled against the bars, and his eyes, those weary, hollow eyes, met hers with a truth she could not look away from. Sarah felt the weight of her badge press heavy on her chest, because this was not a request she could grant easily. It meant reopening wounds for Maria Lopez, the widow who had spent more than 15 years raising children alone, carrying grief like a stone tied to her heart, refusing even to speak Michael's name. That night, Sarah lay awake in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling fan as it spun endlessly, hearing Michael's plea in the silence, imagining Maria's face, imagining the storm of pain that might come with handing her such a letter. She argued with herself for days, weighing justice against mercy, duty against humanity, until finally, with trembling resolve, she carried the request to her superiors. The discussion was not easy. Voices rose, policies were cited, ethics debated. But in the end, a fragile compromise was made. Michael would not meet them, but he could write one final letter, and Sarah herself would deliver it. The day Sarah drove to Maria's modest home, the world outside seemed unusually still. The trees swayed in the warm Texas wind. The gravel crunched under her boots as she approached the door, her heart thundering louder than any alarm she had ever heard inside the prison. Maria opened slowly, her frame frail, but her eyes sharp with years of unspoken sorrow. Her face marked by lines carved not only by time but by grief, the kind that never fully heals. The small living room smelled faintly of old coffee and worn wood, photographs of her late husband still framed on the walls. silent witnesses to the moment unfolding. Sarah handed her the folded letter, the paper slightly crumpled from Michael's shaking hands, and for a long while Maria only stared at it, her lips pressed into a thin line, her fingers trembling as though even touching the envelope might burn. Finally, she broke the seal. As she read, silence filled the room so completely that even the clock on the wall seemed to hold its breath. Michael's words were raw and uneven, scratched and inked that smudged in places where his hands had pressed too hard. He admitted everything, not as though confessing, but as though bearing a wound open. The night of the crime, the horror of seeing a man fall, the years of prison where every clang of the bars reminded him of what he'd stolen from the world. He wrote about nights when guilt wrapped around his throat so tight he thought he might choke, about mornings when he prayed not for freedom but simply for strength to face another day, and how he had tried, however small the effort, to live differently, to guide others away from the path he chose, to honor, in some impossible way, the life he had taken. He ended simply, "I do not ask you to forgive me, because forgiveness is not mine to deserve. I only ask that you know I am sorry, and that I will die carrying that sorrow." Maria's tears fell silently onto the page, smearing the ink as though grief itself wanted to leave its mark. She set the letter down, her breath unsteady, her voice barely a whisper as she said, "For years I wanted him to suffer. For years I wanted to believe he felt nothing. And now I see he has carried this all along. I don't know if I can ever forgive him, but at least he tried." Her words hung heavy in the room. Not release, not absolution, but a fragile thread of humanity that Sarah knew would stay with her forever. Days later, the night of the execution arrived. The prison cloaked in silence thicker than any curfew. Guards stood like statues, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead, the air heavy as though the walls themselves knew what was about to happen. In the chamber, Michael sat with a calmness that seemed almost unreal, his hands folded, his lips moving in quiet prayer, while Sarah stood nearby, fighting the tremor in her chest. The priest whispered blessings, the officials prepared their documents, and in that final moment, Michael turned to Sarah, his voice steady though soft, and said, "Thank you for carrying my words. I don't know if it changes anything, but I can leave this world knowing I tried." His eyes closed, the chamber filled with stillness, and then it was over. Yet outside those walls, as Sarah walked through the gates and into the evening light, the sky burned with shades of orange and purple, the world carrying on as if nothing had happened, while within her something had shifted forever. She realized then that justice is not a single path. It is not only punishment, nor only mercy. It is responsibility, accountability, and the complicated truth that even in the darkest corners of human failure, there remains the smallest glimmer of redemption. That glimmer, fragile and flickering, would stay with her long after the prison doors clanged shut behind her, a reminder that every story has two sides, and sometimes, even at the end,